There's something no one tells you about the person who keeps pulling away from you, the one who makes you feel everything and nothing at the same time, the one who looks at you like you matter more than anything in the world, and then disappears like you never existed. People say they don't care. People say they can't love. People say they're emotionally unavailable. But what if the truth is far more dangerous than that? What if the reason they're acting this way is because they're actually falling for you harder than they ever expected? And what if the very thing you think pushed them away is the exact reason they're now obsessed with you? Stay with me, because if you misunderstand this, you won't just lose them, you'll push them further into the very pattern that keeps them running from love. You see, not everyone experiences love the same way. For some people, love feels like home. It feels safe, warm, predictable. But for others, love feels like a threat. It feels like losing control. It feels like standing on the edge of something they were never taught how to hold on to. And when someone like that starts to feel something real, something deep, something they can't explain, their first instinct isn't to run toward it. It's to run away. Not because they don't care, but because they care more than they know how to handle. And that's the part that confuses you, because you felt it too. You saw it in their eyes. You felt it in the way they were with you in those quiet moments. It was real. It was intense. And then suddenly, it was gone. Or at least, that's what it felt like. But here's the truth that most people never understand. When someone like that pulls away, it doesn't always mean their feelings disappeared. Sometimes it means their feelings got too strong, too real, too close to something they've spent their entire life avoiding. Because deep down there's a fear that if they let themselves fully feel this, they'll lose themselves in it. They'll become vulnerable. They'll depend on you, and dependency to them feels like danger. So they create distance, not because they want to lose you, but because they don't know how to keep you without losing themselves. And this is where most people make the biggest mistake. The moment they feel that distance, they panic. They chase, they try harder. They give more, they text more, they explain more, they love louder. Because in their mind, if they can just prove how much they care, everything will go back to how it was. But what they don't realize is that's the exact moment everything starts to fall apart. Because the more you chase someone who's afraid of closeness, the more you confirm their deepest fear. That love equals pressure. That connection equals losing control, that you are becoming someone they can't escape from. And the more that feeling grows, the further they pull away. It's not that your love was wrong. It's that it came in a way they weren't ready to receive. And that hurts, because all you wanted was to be closer. All you wanted was to make it work. But instead it feels like your effort pushed them away. And the worst part, you start blaming yourself. You start thinking maybe you were too much, too emotional, too available, too real. But the truth is, you weren't too much. You just met someone who didn't know how to handle something real. Now here's where everything changes. Because at some point, something shifted inside you. Maybe you got tired. Maybe you felt drained. Maybe you realized that no matter how much you gave, it wasn't being received the way you deserved. And slowly, without even realizing it, you stopped chasing. You stopped trying to fix it. You stopped reaching out the same way. And for the first time, you chose yourself. And that is the moment everything started to change for them. Because when you stopped chasing, you removed the pressure. When you stopped trying to force closeness, you created space. And in that space, something unexpected happened. They started to feel your absence, not just physically, but emotionally. The energy you used to give so freely was no longer there. The reassurance, the attention, the effort, it was gone. And for someone who was used to having that without asking, it hit deeper than you think. Because now, instead of feeling overwhelmed by your presence, they were confronted with your absence. And absence does something powerful. It forces people to feel what they were avoiding. It removes distractions. It creates silence. And in that silence, emotions that were buried start to rise. Thoughts they ignored start to replay. Moments they took for granted start to mean something. And suddenly the person who once felt like too much becomes the one they can't stop thinking about. This is the part no one prepares you for, because you think that if someone really cared, they would have stayed. You think that love should be simple, that it should be consistent. But with someone like this, love doesn't show up in a straight line. It shows up in contradictions, in confusion, in moments of closeness followed by distance. And the hardest part is learning that sometimes the way they love you doesn't look like love at all. But here's what you need to understand. When someone like this starts to fall, it doesn't happen in the way you expect. It doesn't come with grand gestures or constant reassurance. It comes quietly, internally, in ways they may never even admit out loud. They start watching you more closely, paying attention in ways you don't see, thinking about you in moments you're not there, feeling something they can't fully explain, but can't ignore either. And the reason this is happening isn't because you did more, it's because you did less. You didn't chase, you didn't force, you didn't beg for clarity. You stepped back, you created space, and in doing that, you became something rare in their world. You became someone who didn't try to control them, someone who didn't demand from them, someone who existed without needing them to validate your worth. And that is what makes them fall. Not your effort, not your words, not your attempts to prove your love, but your ability to stand on your own, your ability to walk away from something that wasn't meeting you where you are, your ability to choose yourself, even when it hurt. Because in that moment you stopped being predictable, you stopped being someone they could take for granted, and you became someone they could lose. And nothing triggers deeper emotion in someone like this than the realization that they might actually lose something real. So if you've been sitting there wondering what changed, why they suddenly started acting differently, why they seem more interested now than they were before, this is why. It wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, it was a shift in energy, a shift in how you showed up, a shift in what you were willing to tolerate. But here's the part you need to be careful with. Just because they're starting to feel something doesn't mean they suddenly understand it. Just because they're coming closer doesn't mean the fear is gone. In fact, sometimes the closer they feel, the stronger that fear becomes. And if you go back to chasing, if you go back to overgiving, if you go back to losing yourself in them, you risk restarting the same cycle all over again. So right now, more than ever, you need to stay grounded in what you've become. Not who you were when you were trying to make it work, but who you became when you stopped trying to force it. Because that version of you, the one who chose peace over chaos, the one who chose self-respect over emotional exhaustion, the one who learned to walk away instead of chase, that's the version they're falling for. And the truth is, they didn't fall in love because you held on. They started falling the moment you let go. And that's the part that changes everything. Because now you're no longer dealing with the same dynamic you were before. Before, you were the one reaching, the one wondering, the one trying to hold something together that felt like it was slipping through your hands. But now, something has shifted, not just in them, but in you. And whether you fully realize it or not, that shift is what created the version of you they can't ignore anymore. Because what you stepped into was emotional independence. And emotional independence isn't cold, it isn't distant, it isn't pretending you don't care. It's something much deeper than that. It's the ability to feel everything without needing someone else to complete you. It's the ability to love without losing yourself in the process. And for someone who has spent their entire life fearing closeness, that kind of energy feels different. It feels safe, but also unfamiliar. Because they're used to people clinging, they're used to people needing, they're used to being the center of someone else's emotional world. But you stepped out of that pattern. You stopped orbiting around them. You stopped making them the source of your happiness, and instead you became your own center, your own stability, your own peace. And that is what made you powerful in their eyes. Not because you were trying to impress them, but because you weren't trying at all anymore. You were just being, living, moving forward. And for someone who once felt like they had control over the connection, this is where the roles begin to reverse. Because now, they're the ones feeling uncertain. They're the ones wondering what you're thinking, what you're feeling, if you've moved on, if they've lost you. And uncertainty is something they're not used to feeling in this way. It pulls them in, it makes them pay attention. It makes them aware of something they were able to ignore before. And suddenly, your silence becomes louder than anything you ever said. Because silence carries weight, it carries meaning. It forces people to fill in the gaps with their own thoughts. And for someone who has been avoiding their emotions, that silence becomes a mirror. It reflects everything they've been trying not to feel. The memories, the moments, the connection they brushed off like it didn't matter. It all comes back, not because you reminded them, but because you stopped reminding them. And that's what makes it powerful. You didn't argue your way into their heart. You didn't convince them. You didn't beg them to see your value. You simply removed yourself from the equation and allowed them to experience what life feels like without you in it. And that absence, it creates a kind of tension that no amount of words ever could. Because now, they have to sit with the reality of what they might have lost. And here's where it gets even deeper. When you stopped showing up the same way, you also became unpredictable, not in a manipulative way, not in a game-playing way, but in a way that broke the pattern they had grown comfortable with. Before, they knew exactly what to expect from you. They knew you would respond. They knew you would be there. They knew you cared. And that predictability made it easy for them to stay emotionally distant because they never had to question your presence. But once that predictability disappeared, everything changed. Now they don't know when you'll reply. They don't know how you feel. They don't know if they still have access to you the way they used to. And that uncertainty creates curiosity. It creates intrigue. It makes them lean in instead of pulling away. Because humans are naturally drawn to what they don't fully understand. And when someone who was once completely available suddenly becomes less accessible, it triggers something deep. It makes them want to figure you out. And the more they try to figure you out, the more they think about you. And the more they think about you, the more those feelings they were suppressing start to grow. But here's the key part that most people miss. You didn't become unpredictable by playing games. You became unpredictable by choosing yourself, by focusing on your life, by not making them your priority anymore. And that authenticity, that real shift, is what makes it so powerful. Because they can feel the difference. They can sense that you're no longer waiting in the same way, that you're no longer emotionally dependent on their presence. And for someone who fears being trapped, this actually makes them feel safer getting closer. Because now, they don't feel like they're walking into something that will consume them. They feel like they're approaching someone who is whole on their own. Someone who doesn't need them, but chooses them. And that distinction, it changes everything. At the same time, there's another layer to this that goes even deeper. You didn't try to fix them. Think about that. You didn't try to analyze every behavior. You didn't try to force them to open up. You didn't try to break down their walls. You didn't try to heal wounds they weren't ready to face. And in doing that, you gave them something they rarely experience. You gave them space to exist as they are, without pressure. Because most people, when they encounter someone emotionally distant, immediately try to solve it. They try to understand it, fix it, change it. But for someone who has built their identity around protecting themselves, that feels invasive. It feels like someone is trying to take away the very thing that makes them feel safe. So they resist, they shut down, they pull away even more. But you stepped back. You allowed them to be exactly who they are, without trying to force them into something they're not ready for. And in that space, something unexpected happens. They start to lower their guard, not because you pushed them to, but because they no longer feel threatened. And when someone like this stops feeling threatened, that's when their real emotions start to surface. Slowly, quietly, internally, they start to feel safe enough to explore what they've been avoiding. They start to question their own patterns. They start to notice how different you are from what they're used to. And that difference, it stays with them. It lingers, it grows. But there's always a moment, a turning point, where everything becomes real for them. It's the moment they realize they might actually lose you. Not in a dramatic, obvious way. Not necessarily through a big goodbye or a final conversation. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the way your energy shifts, the way you stop reaching out, the way you start living your life without including them in it. And at first they might not react. They might tell themselves it doesn't matter, that it's fine, that this is what they wanted. But then it hits, in a quiet moment, in the middle of the night, in a random memory that comes out of nowhere. They start to feel it, the absence, the difference, the space where you used to be. And that's when the realization begins to sink in. You're not as available as you once were. You're not as easy to reach. You're not waiting in the same way. And suddenly, you're not guaranteed anymore. And that realization triggers something powerful. Because for the first time, they're no longer in control of the connection. For the first time, they're the ones who could lose something real. And loss is one of the strongest emotional triggers there is. It forces clarity. It forces awareness. It forces feelings to rise to the surface whether they want them to or not. And that's when everything starts to shift inside them. Because now, it's no longer about avoiding closeness. It's about confronting the possibility of losing it altogether. And when someone like this reaches that point, when they truly feel like they could lose you, that's when their emotions become undeniable. That's when they start moving toward you instead of away. That's when they start feeling something they can't suppress anymore. That's when they begin to fall, not slowly, not cautiously, but deeply, intensely, and in a way that even they don't fully understand. But this is also the most delicate part of the entire dynamic, because this is where everything can either transform or repeat. Because as they start to come closer, as they start to show more interest, as they begin to open up in ways they didn't before, you might feel that pull to go back to how things used to be, to give more, to chase again, to lean in with the same energy you had before. But if you do that, you risk undoing everything that created this shift in the first place. Because they didn't fall because you chased, they fell because you stopped. They didn't feel safe because you gave more, they felt safe because you gave space. They didn't become curious because you explained yourself, they became curious because you became a mystery. So now, the question isn't just why they're falling. The question is, can you maintain the version of yourself that made them fall in the first place? Because that version of you, the one who stands in their own power, the one who doesn't lose themselves in someone else's confusion, the one who chooses peace over emotional chaos, that's the version that holds the connection together. And the moment you forget that is the moment the pattern tries to return. So as they come closer, don't lose yourself again. Because this time, it's not about making them fall. It's about not falling back into who you used to be. So as they come closer, don't lose yourself again, because now you're stepping into the phase where everything feels more intense than ever before. The energy shifts, the attention increases, the connection starts to feel alive again, but this time, it carries a different weight. This isn't the same dynamic you had before. This is deeper, more fragile, more real. And if you don't understand what's actually happening beneath the surface, you might misread it and accidentally destroy the very thing you created. Because what you're seeing now isn't just them coming back. It's the psychological effect of distance finally doing its work. When you stepped away, when you created space, when you stopped feeding the connection with constant energy, you activated something powerful inside them. You activated awareness. You activated desire. You activated emotion that had been buried under layers of avoidance. Distance has a way of doing that. It strips everything down to what's real. It removes distractions. It forces someone to confront what they feel without the comfort of your presence softening it. And for someone who has spent so long avoiding emotional depth, that distance becomes almost like pressure building inside them. At first, they resist it. They distract themselves, they tell themselves it doesn't matter. But emotions don't disappear just because you ignore them. They wait, they build, and eventually they demand to be felt. And when they finally do, it doesn't come out in a calm, controlled way. It comes out intensely. That's why, when someone like this starts to fall, it often feels sudden, like a switch flipped, like they went from distant to deeply invested almost overnight. But what you don't see is everything that was happening internally before that moment, the thoughts they kept pushing away, the memories they replayed in silence, the way your absence slowly turned into something they couldn't ignore anymore. And now, they're feeling it all at once. That's why it can feel like they're falling harder than anyone else ever has. Because in a way they are. Not because they love more than others, but because they've been holding it back for so long that when it finally surfaces, it comes out with force, it comes out unfiltered. It comes out in a way that even they don't fully understand. But here's the part that can confuse you if you're not prepared for it. Just because they're feeling deeply doesn't mean they're free from fear. In fact, sometimes the deeper they fall, the more afraid they become. Because now the connection is no longer something they can keep at a distance. It's real, it matters, it has the power to affect them, and that means it also has the power to hurt them. And for someone who has built their entire emotional world around avoiding pain, that realization can be overwhelming. So what happens? They get closer, and then they hesitate. They open up, and then they pull back. They show you glimpses of how they feel, and then suddenly become distant again. And if you don't understand this, you'll think something is wrong. You'll think they're losing interest. You'll think the connection is fading. But the truth is, this push and pull is often a reflection of how much they're actually feeling, because they're caught between two forces: the desire to be close to you and the fear of what that closeness means. And this is where your awareness becomes everything. Because if you react to their fear with pressure, if you respond to their hesitation by chasing again, you'll push them right back into their old pattern. But if you stay grounded, if you allow them to feel without forcing them to explain, if you maintain the same emotional independence that brought them closer in the first place, you give them the space to move through that fear instead of running from it. And as they navigate this internally, something else begins to show, something much more subtle, but incredibly telling. They start becoming quietly obsessed with you, not in an obvious, over-the-top way, not always in a way they'll openly admit, but in small, consistent patterns that reveal how much space you've taken up in their mind. They check your presence without letting you know. They notice details about you they never paid attention to before. They remember things you said, things you did, moments that seemed small at the time but now carry meaning. You might catch glimpses of it, the way they suddenly show up again after being distant, the way they initiate contact out of nowhere, the way they seem more aware of you, more tuned in, more present when you're around. And then they disappear again, not because they don't care, but because they care enough to feel overwhelmed. And that's the paradox you're dealing with. The more they feel, the more they have to process. The more they process, the more they need space, and the more space they take, the more it tests your ability to stay grounded in yourself. But here's where the deeper truth comes in. This isn't just about their feelings. This is about timing. Because no matter how strong the connection is, no matter how deeply they feel, if they're not ready to face their own patterns, their own fears, their own emotional walls, love alone won't be enough to make it work. And that's one of the hardest things to accept, because you can feel the connection, you can see the potential, you can sense that what's there is real. But if they're still operating from a place of fear, if they're still running from vulnerability, then even the strongest feelings can get lost in that internal conflict. And that's why some connections feel so intense, yet so unstable. It's not because the love isn't there, it's because the readiness isn't. And you have to understand that not to excuse their behavior, but to protect yourself from losing your own center in the process. Because at this stage, it's very easy to get pulled back into old patterns, to start over-analyzing their behavior, to start questioning where you stand, to start giving more again in hopes of stabilizing the connection. But the truth is, the stability doesn't come from you doing more. It comes from you staying who you've become. Because the moment you shift back into seeking validation, the moment you start chasing clarity, the moment you begin to lose your emotional independence, you change the dynamic again, and not in your favor. So instead, you stay grounded. You allow the connection to unfold without forcing it. You observe without overreacting. You feel without attaching your entire sense of self to what they do or don't do. And in doing that, you create something rare. You create a space where they can feel without pressure, where they can come closer without feeling trapped, where they can explore their emotions without being overwhelmed by expectations. And that space is what gives the connection a chance to grow into something real, but it also reveals something deeper. Because as you continue to hold that energy, as you continue to show up as someone who is whole on their own, you'll start to see clearly whether they're capable of meeting you there, not through their words, but through their actions, through their consistency, through their willingness to move past their own fears instead of hiding behind them. And that's when the real truth becomes undeniable. Because no matter how deeply someone feels, if they're not willing to grow, if they're not willing to face themselves, if they're not willing to show up in a way that matches the connection, then you're left carrying something that was never yours to carry alone. And you deserve more than that. You deserve someone who doesn't just feel deeply, but shows up fully. Someone who doesn't just come close when it's easy, but stays when it matters. Someone who doesn't just fall for you in silence, but chooses you in reality. And until that happens, your power remains in one place, in not abandoning yourself. Because at the end of all this, after the confusion, the intensity, the push and pull, the moments of closeness and distance, there's one thing that matters more than anything else. Not whether they fall, not whether they come back, not whether they realize what they feel, but whether you stay true to the version of yourself that no longer chases, no longer settles, and no longer forgets their own worth in the process. Because that version of you is the reason they started falling in the first place. And it's the only version that will keep you from falling back into something that takes more than it gives. Because now you've reached the point where everything becomes clear, even if it doesn't feel easy. This is where the illusion fades and the truth steps forward. Not the fantasy of what this connection could be, but the reality of what it actually is, and more importantly, what it's becoming. At this stage, timing reveals itself in a way you can't ignore anymore. You can feel everything, the intensity, the pull, the way they look at you now, the way they come closer than they ever did before. It feels different, it feels real, and for a moment, it's easy to believe that this is it, that everything has finally aligned, that all the distance, all the confusion, all the waiting has led to this moment where it finally works. But timing isn't just about feelings. Timing is about readiness. It's about whether someone is capable of holding what they feel, or whether they're still controlled by the very fears that made them run in the first place. And this is the part that requires the most honesty from you, because you can't confuse emotional intensity with emotional availability. You can't mistake someone feeling deeply for someone being ready to stay consistently. You can't assume that just because they came back, they've transformed. Sometimes they have, and sometimes they haven't. The only way you'll know is by watching what they do next. Not what they say, not what they promise, not how intense their emotions feel in the moment, but how they show up over time. Do they stay even when things get uncomfortable? Do they communicate even when it's hard? Do they move toward you instead of disappearing when things become real? Because that's what separates a connection that feels powerful from one that actually is stable. If the timing is right, if they've reached a point where they're ready to face themselves, then something beautiful starts to happen. The same person who once ran from closeness starts leaning into it. The same person who once avoided emotions starts expressing them. The same person who once kept you at a distance starts choosing you, not just in moments, but in consistency. And when that happens, it doesn't feel chaotic anymore. It feels calm, grounded, real. But if the timing isn't right, you'll feel that too, not through a lack of emotion, but through inconsistency, through hesitation, through moments of closeness that are followed by distance again, through effort that comes and goes instead of staying steady. And that's when you're faced with the most important decision of all, not whether they love you, but whether they're able to love you in a way that meets you where you are. Because love on its own is not enough. It never has been. It has to be supported by action, by presence, by emotional responsibility. And if that's missing, then no matter how deep the feelings are, the connection will always feel like something you have to hold together on your own. And you've already learned what that feels like. You've already lived through the confusion, the overthinking, the emotional exhaustion of trying to make something work that wasn't fully meeting you. You didn't come this far just to go back to that version of yourself, because something inside you changed. Something inside you woke up. You stopped chasing. You stopped forcing. You stopped abandoning yourself for the sake of keeping someone else. And that shift, that transformation, is the most important part of this entire journey. Because now you're no longer just reacting to the connection. You're choosing what you allow into your life. And that choice is where your power lives. Because whether they step up or not, Whether they grow or not, whether they meet you or not, you no longer lose yourself in the process. And that's what changes everything. Now, instead of asking, do they love me? You start asking, is this enough for me? Instead of wondering, why are they pulling away, you start noticing, am I being met consistently? Instead of trying to understand their behavior, you start honoring your own needs. And in doing that, you shift the entire dynamic once again. But this time it's permanent, because this isn't about making them fall anymore. It's about making sure you don't fall into something that costs you your peace. And ironically, that's what keeps them emotionally invested. Because the one thing that makes someone like this stay isn't pressure, it isn't chasing, it isn't convincing. It's the quiet understanding that you won't wait forever, that you won't lose yourself again, that you are capable of walking away, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And that awareness, that subtle energy, creates a kind of respect that they can feel. Because now, you're no longer someone they can take for granted. You're someone they have to choose consciously. And if they do choose you, if they step forward with consistency, with presence, with real effort, then something rare begins to form, a connection that isn't based on chasing and running, but on mutual understanding, on balance, on two people meeting each other without losing themselves. But if they don't, if they remain stuck in their patterns, if they continue to come and go, if they show you just enough to keep you there but not enough to build something real, then the truth becomes undeniable. They may feel deeply, but they're not ready. And you have to be strong enough to accept that without trying to change it. Because your role was never to fix them, never to heal them, never to prove your worth until they finally see it. Your role was to become someone who no longer settles for less than what they deserve. And you've already done that. That's why everything shifted. That's why they started falling. That's why they came closer. Not because you convinced them, but because you transformed. And now the final truth reveals itself. They didn't fall in love with your effort. They didn't fall because you chased them. They didn't fall because you stayed when it was hard. They fell because of who you became when you stopped doing all of that. They fell in love with your strength, your independence, your ability to walk away from something that wasn't aligned, your ability to stand in your worth even when it meant losing them. And that version of you is the most powerful thing you have. So don't lose it now. Not when they're coming closer, not when it finally feels like things are shifting, not when the connection starts to feel real again. Because the moment you abandon that version of yourself is the moment everything starts to fall apart again. So stay grounded, stay aware, stay connected to yourself first. Because whether this turns into something lasting or becomes another lesson, you've already won. You've already become the person who no longer chases love, but attracts it. And that is something no one can take away from you.